Welcome to EDO Breakthrough, the podcast where we tackle economic development challenges head on. From small towns to bustling cities, every place has its own hurdles to overcome. The EDO Breakthrough podcast creates an environment of collaboration, innovation, and understanding where we can share our real-life challenges and brainstorm solutions. I'm your host, Sandy Dubé, a certified economic developer and founder of PPR Strategies. Each week, we'll be welcoming a different, brilliant, place-based mind to talk through real-life economic development challenges that have been shared with us by you, our gracious listeners. Welcome to Season 2 of the EDO Breakthrough podcast. I am your host, Sandy Dubé, and today I am joined by Jonathan Aberman. Jonathan has done many different things, and I'm going to let him introduce himself. Jonathan, could you introduce yourself to our listeners today?
Hello, listeners. I guess that the best way to describe myself would be I've been part of the D.C. region now for far too long. And my day job is entrepreneurship, and my night job is entrepreneurship. And that plays out in lots of different ways, depending upon, frankly, what's in front of me. I'm an investor, a venture investor, partner in Ruxton Ventures. Hopefully, many of you read my columns in the Washington Business Journal or listen to my podcast, What's Working in Washington. I do a lot of economic development research with Terry Clower at George Mason University, and work with a number of universities as executive residence or strategic advisor. At the moment, I'm working with Virginia Tech, and I'm also working with a really interesting liberal arts business school in Rome called John Cabot University, which is the only American accredited English language university in Italy that teaches and gives degrees licensed by American accreditors. So other than that, I play my guitar in a two-car living room, and I'm just happy to be here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. Yes, you are put in that kind of thought leader perspective when it comes to what's happening in economic development in this region and regionalism. And I'd love to get through some of those nuggets. But first, kind of the premise of the EDO Breakthrough is to talk a little bit about, where you had that aha moment of economic development. And we ask our audience, encourage them to submit questions. And our questions are often centered around career development and advancement. Could you talk a little bit about how you first heard of economic development and this phrase and where you lean in that space?
That's really interesting because I grew up in a very political family, and it was almost expected that if you were going to be at all engaged in life or at all educated or at all successful, you had a responsibility to try to make the world a better place. My parents were both very politically active, and I've always been that kind of person. And my education was political science and then economics and business. And before I became a lawyer and an investment banker. And when I studied international law and international economics, I lived overseas and studied at the London School of Economics in London. So I suspect I'm probably the only Marxist economist I know that talks about the economic development of the region. But when you study economics in the context of a place like the London School of Economics, they teach political economy, the idea that economics and politics are actually one and the same. And I'm a little bit flippant, but Marx, even though Marxism is discredited here because of the Soviet Union, Marx was a political philosopher, basically said you can't understand economics without understanding politics. And so with that viewpoint, and Keynesianism as well, I came back to the United States and I started to practice law up in New York. And eventually I found my way down here to D.C. And I was a venture capital lawyer in the late 90s, helping with the first internet bubble. And because of my natural proclivity towards wanting to use my expertise to try to help the community, and because of my economics and business background, before too long, I found myself on different advisory boards, including George Mason University's advisory board around their economic development activities with Roger Stow. And I found by not long after I moved here, I was getting involved with policy discussions around things like how to develop the biotech industry with then Governor Warner, how to grow Mason's intellectual property, how to help the government grow. I started to work with the Obama administration around various things like Startup America. And somewhere along the line, my desire to serve the community, my insights around you have to make political choices to grow an economy became what people would describe as economic development. So I think I sort of backed into it without thinking about it as a term of art, but backing into it because of my background and my expertise. I was drawn into conversations by people engaged in what they would call economic development activity. And so that's the way it sort of happened for me. It was largely an accident of ambition, I suppose. And the ambition was wanting to do something good and be useful. And, eventually, of course, I began to see that I was becoming a expert, I guess, on these areas. And I decided to really lean in. And a lot of the work I started to do with my wife, Veronica, who co-owns our economic consulting business with me, we started to lean into economic development projects like work we did for the 2030 group, Montgomery County, the U.S. government, where we started to talk about innovation models and clustering and all these things. So I sort of backdoored into having to understand the methodology of economic development, the choices, in order to be able to influence conversation better. And here we are in 2024, and you and I are talking about economic development, and people care what I think. And I guess I'll humbly say it sort of happened a little bit by accident, but I'm glad it did.
Nice. I'm curious about the venture piece of things and what you choose to invest in and how some of those choices come to play. What does that look like?
That's a great question from the standpoint of it gives me an opportunity to expand on something that people often get confused about when they look at my career, and they'll say, "Wow, you do so many different things. How do you keep it straight?" And the answer is actually I only do one real thing, which is find entrepreneurial people and figure out how to help them succeed. And really, when you look at economic development, whether was working with Bob Buchanan or Bob Sweeney or anybody, I'm really just helping them. Well, with entrepreneurship, most of, if not all, what I do at Ruxton Ventures, and I did previously on my own Amplifier Ventures, was find interesting founders and provide my expertise to do the things that they didn't know how to do, how to scale a business, organizational growth, how to raise capital, all these other things. And what happens now is a lot of my understanding about the economy and economic development really overlap and cause me to identify macro trends. So if you look, for example, at the current portfolio of companies that Ruxton's involved in, a lot of them are marketplace deals or technology deals that are involved in some way with how AI is reshaping the world. Whether it's an Advisorly that is a online marketplace to help community college students find their way to four-year universities, which has got a very strong AI component, has grown like crazy, or it's a Scamnetic that is an anti-fraud technology that uses AI to identify frauds, or a news company that I'm stealthily starting with some partners now that's going to basically identify the human value add in AI. What they all have in common is they're taking advantage of these massive economic development trends. But if you look on the other side about how I'm writing about the region and the region's challenges and opportunities, you'll see I'm really concerned that this region is missing the boat on AI and is largely going to be obscured by Silicon Valley, particularly in the Trump administration, where there's going to be a lack of regulation. There's going to be less for DC to do and a lot more for Silicon Valley to do. So it's all, frankly, it's all part of the same quantum foam as it is for me. And that's how it all makes sense. And that's why, here I am talking with you today about economic development. Before I talk with you, I was talking with a company around a potential exit. And then this afternoon, I'm talking with another company around a pricing model. It's just my days.
Mm-hmm.
But it all makes sense to me. I guess that's what matters ultimately.
Yeah, well, and to be honest, you are the common glue then in that day and figuring out how you want to do, how you want to invest your time and energy, and finding projects that are passionate and individuals, other humans that you connect with and can provide value in that space.
And you
So,
know what? Frankly, I think that you've identified the fundamental thing that I think will be our saving grace if we tap into it, which is, AI will get smarter and smarter and smarter at providing commoditization of knowledge. AI is never going to be able to connect with humans the way humans connect with humans. And the more that we understand that and appreciate it, the more we train people to understand that true connection is what matters, and the value add that comes from true connection insight is ultimately what we have to train our students for. Oh, geez, we don't figure that out. We are literally going to allow people to get commoditized and get them really alienated. So yeah, that's what I do all day. I'm trying to walk the walk and hopefully inspiring others.
yeah. I was having a conversation earlier today about relationships, and you're right there. Whereas I might have a relationship with AI and utilizing it as a tool and trying to, figure out how to work a little bit more efficiently. At the end of the day, it has no feeling. It's not going to really bind us together through a shared experience or story.
Well, what it will do is it will create a common, it will create a common strata. It will create a common and broadly diffuse baseline of knowledge, and frankly a baseline for how the knowledge is expressed. It's the nature of how these large language models work. And I think that it will and will get much better at emulating human connection. There was a study or an experiment done. They published the results but 6 months ago, that when people were given the choice of interacting with the psychiatrist through a chat or interacting with the chatbot, they actually found the chatbot more empathetic, which just goes to show the old cliche, you can fake sincerity. It's true. But what I'm getting at is at the end of the day, I think that people are going to start to crave authenticity. They're going to know that they're being served up with a commodity. They're going to know that they're being served with a commonplace, and they're going to crave it more and more. I recently interviewed an author for my own podcast. It'll air, I think, in the next little while, Bill Van Eppel, and he wrote a book about the interplay between a human desire for connection and a desire for autonomy. And that if you actually look at those two coordinates, you can actually explain human behavior. It's that struggle. I think it's the connection part that's ultimately going to save the day. I really do. If we allow it, if we actually allow our society to provide economic value for connection, which is really an interesting question.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to unpack that a little bit. I
Yeah.
think,
All right.
yeah, yes, yes. Um, so you mentioned, obviously this region and AI and, second round of the Trump administration and, a place for it and stuff like that. I'm curious if there are things that you're seeing that this region, that this DC, Baltimore metro region, greater Washington area could or should be doing to stay relevant, to stay current in this space.
Well, I have been concerned for quite some time that, and I've written about this a lot to the point where I think it's irritated many people. But the problem with this region fundamentally is that we have for years confused process service innovation for product innovation, meaning that we are really, really good at providing technology as a service to the federal government or providing knowledge as a service. Consultants, we are really good at that. The problem is that when 9/11 happened 20 something years ago, the tech bubble that we were in the middle of, which was a telecom bubble that we really were in the forefront in, Silicon Valley went off into social media and Web 2.0, which fundamentally was taking technology and delivering product. Once you create it once, you could do it again and again. Sure, it was delivered within a browser, so it was quote a service, but it was really a product, a productization of technology. We went full bore into national security and delivering technology as consultants. There's no better example of that than the cybersecurity industry, which is an industry that we're very relevant in. If you look at how Silicon Valley plays in cyber, which has been product-based, how we play in it, which is service-based through big companies like Booz and General Dynamics and so forth. There's room for both. But the problem is that as we've gone further and further into a world where technology is where all the high growth jobs are, not having a product-led economy has caused us to lag. putting aside the feel-good articles that get written by various folks here, the reality is that this place has been a venture capital backwater for about 20 years and continues to be so. We do not get the venture capital that we should for the number of knowledge workers. And that is because fundamentally we don't do product companies, we do service companies. There's a lot more private equity here helping government contractors buy government contractors. So we've always been overexposed to major technological change that gets delivered as product, whether that's cryptocurrency or it's AI or it's quantum computing or just plain old software. We just made a choice. And the choice for a long time was very rewarding. We didn't grow very fast. If you look at our economic growth, again, this Terry Clower has written about this a lot and hasn't made him very popular either. We basically lag every region in the United States and have for quite some time on economic growth. We're steady, we're slow, but we're not fast. But we're really expensive and we have a really bad housing cost, particularly for our level of growth. So okay, that's where we were. The challenge right now is that, and this is not me being political. This is me just stating the fact, which is that this administration, one, in part because of its close association with parts of the tech community in Silicon Valley that are very anti-regulation in two big areas. And those two big areas are cryptocurrency and AI. And whether you think they're right or wrong is largely irrelevant. The fact of the matter is that this administration is going to be very tolerant of and create a regulatory regime that will allow both of those technologies to grow very, very fast without constraints. That is going to, with respect to AI in particular, and national security, provide a very interesting challenge because before Donald Trump became president again, Silicon Valley had already decided that they were going to go after national security and national defense in a big way. This was already happening. Y Combinator, which is basically the Harvard of startup incubators, this most recent year wanted a third of their startups to be national security related. Mark Andreessen and Andreessen Horowitz was already making a big push into national security and was already opening an office here. And I wrote about this. The Visigoths are at the gate. Well, guess what? The Visigoths are now past the gate. And I think that our local government contract community is facing an existential threat. And I don't know if they really understand it very well. I hope they do, but they are in rapid danger of being disintermediated and having West Coast Silicon Valley product companies come in and take more and more of the technology stack previously occupied by them delivering technology as a service. Meanwhile, I think the Trump administration is very serious about shrinking government, particularly around the parts of the government that I would say were Great Society or New Deal type programs. I actually kid around and say that we're now entering a new phase, which is called the No Deal approach. But with this new approach, things like Medicaid, Medicare, Department of Education, various things, they're definitely under significant threat of shrinking. If they shrink and there's less dollars spent, this is going to harm our government contractor community. A lot of 8As are going to suffer. And then if they repatriate, move some of these functions out of the area, which they're thinking about doing, that could also create job losses. So to me, what should the region be doing? In the first instance, the region should wake up, and our leaders who, frankly, many of them are much more interested in ruling in hell than serving in heaven. I mean, if I had $1 for every time a CEO of a local trade group says, I'm going to solve this problem, I'd be a rich man. I've seen, the only time I've ever seen this region work together really well was Amazon. And that was largely because the Greater Washington Partnership made everybody behave themselves. But right now, I think that the biggest danger is that people can see the problem, but they all want to grab the stick and fly the plane. I mean, the Northern Virginia, Technology Council just released a report. Just to be blunt, everything they said, I wrote about 5 years ago. Everything that's in their report, I wrote about 5 years ago. They could have taken my work 5 years ago and they could have expanded on it. But instead, they go off and write a brand new report so that they can say that they understand what's going on. Northern Virginia Chamber is going to do the same thing. Montgomery County do the same thing. The biggest danger right now is our regional leaders are not going to collaborate because they all want to be the ones that win. This is not a time for individuals to win. This is a time for all hands on deck. And I do have some prescriptions, but I think that the place begins with, stop worrying about who's going to be on the front page of the Business Journal and start worrying about whether or not you're going to stop an erosion of jobs that, frankly, once it starts, we're going to solve the expensive housing problem really easily. It's going to be inflation's up and prices are down. So anyway, so yeah, number one would be snap out of it, folks. Get busy.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I've always wondered why can't people just get out of their own way? And some element of that. And but I think it is kind of a philosophical change in the way that they approach it, and it's not where people lean in. Generally, is in this idea of you know I'm going to give up a little bit so that we, as the greater good, can get something for the greater good.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't even say it's to me. It's more simple than that. It's not that the people that beat their chests don't care about the public good, because they do, and I think that they have a sincere belief that they are doing the right thing. I think the problem is just fundamentally, having worked in Silicon Valley and other places I've worked here, is that in this town you're only really relevant. I think I've been able to fight against this, but for the most part, you're only relevant if you sit on top of an organization.
Mm.
And an organization is only relevant if it has members, because we are the kings and queens of trade associations. So when you have an economic development model that depends upon regional groups that are largely trade associations, and then you have regions where you have politicians who are elected to protect the economic interests of their constituents, you have a lot of people who have a lot of interest in making sure they are the ones that are seen as solving the problem. It's just career growth. I don't blame them, but to me, ultimately, if the region is going to succeed, we need to at least acknowledge that there may be ideas or programs that need to be done that, frankly, nobody owns and nobody can take credit for, me included, just need to happen. You know?
Yeah, so I'm curious of, kind of in the perfect world and whatever the scenario could or should look like, how should the states be collaborating, to address some of these, housing or workforce shortages or, some of these truly regional challenges?
Well, what's really interesting to me is that, and this is going back to something I said earlier, when I decided to become more academically grounded in economic development, made a commitment to it. One of the things that I learned was that every region in the country that we compete with that's currently kicking our tails has at the middle of it a business led group that advocates and organizes and fights for economic development. I mean, whether you're talking about Denver, LA, Austin, Boston, New York. And we often, I think, hide behind, well, we can't expect Maryland and Virginia and DC to collaborate. So therefore, that's sort of, I think, a canard that people throw to be off the hook. To me, the biggest tragedy of the last 5 years from the standpoint of economic development has been the Greater Washington Partnership's unwillingness to seize the mantle of actually being the business group leaders that they could have been. I think that with respect to Amazon, they showed tremendous leadership. But then, frankly, I think that they went off in a direction of trying to, I don't know. I can't really say what they were trying to do, because I helped Russ Ramsey start the partnership, but I really haven't been too involved in it, over the last 4 or 5 years. But it just seems to me that at the end of the day, the only way we're going to solve these problems or these issues is to have the business leaders, not the politicians, the business leaders say, I don't really care whether the FBI is in Virginia or DC or Maryland. I really don't care. What I care about is that the FBI is in this region. I really don't care whether the Wizards are in DC or in National Landing or in Baltimore. I really don't care. I just need to have that amenity here. And ultimately, politicians are going to fight to serve their jurisdictions. That's their job. And the economic development officers who work for them are going to fight for the jurisdictions. That's their job. Business people should look at Albany and say, you should do your thing, but understand we're going to build our real estate developments where the proffers are more, manageable. We're going to locate our factories where the incentives are good and where there's power available for our server farms. We're going to locate our data center where you're willing to have it. We're going to locate the casino where you're willing to have it. In other words, politicians are always going to compete, but at the end of the day, business people get to choose where they want to locate their businesses. And frankly, I don't think they've been loud enough about that, and I think the region suffers for it.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. I think in thinking through that kind of public-private collaboration, who's on first,
Hmm.
and who is the coach and who is the really verbal player that's out there and doing it. It's an interesting. You got me
What's
thinking about that too.
interesting? Yeah, an illustrative example that we can look at is Northern Virginia was a backwater, 40 years ago. It was a backwater. It was, Tyson's Corner was the moon. And when what happened? A group of self-interested real estate developers and government contractors decided that they were going to make Northern Virginia an economically important place and a place where people wanted to live. George Mason University, Wolf Trap, the Tower Club, the government contractor industry, all these things came out of enlightened decisions. The real estate, commercial real estate, Reston Town Center. I mean, all these things came out of fundamentally self-interested people who realized that together they could drive community growth. And that generation is largely aged out. There are a few still active that are left, but guys like Till Hazel, Ed Bursoff, Mike Daniels, and many others, they decided, or Williams, they decided that it was better for them to work together. And it was self-interested. The real estate developers did well, the business people did well. And that's what I'm getting to, is that ultimately, if you look at regional economic development, there's always a group of self-interested business people that drive the community. It's just the way it is, because ultimately, here's a news flash: the people with money are the most interesting people to the politicians. It's kind of the way your system works.
Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
Mm,
Thank
mm.
you. Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit here. And I know you were recently in Italy and you had talked about your collaboration and partnership in
Mhm.
terms of teaching. And can you talk a little bit about what you are teaching, entrepreneurship and other things in Rome?
I'm glad you asked me about that, because it's definitely been a lot of fun for me. It's a labor of love. So John Cabot University is an American accredited university, accredited under the Mid-Atlantic accreditations scheme. It's AACSB accredited business school. All the instructions in English. It's an American university sitting in Rome. I, as somebody who really cares about humanism, I suppose, has always been very, very interested in Italian culture. A lot of what we think about and experience in Western culture really does start with it starts with the Roman Republic and works through the Medicis and the Renaissance and the popes and onward. And when you spend time in Italy and you really delve into it, it's hard not to both be really humbled by the depth of experience, but also really reminded that the past is a prologue. And so the idea of being involved in educating students, particularly on liberal arts and business, in an environment like that was just fairly interesting to me. And over the years, as I expanded my interests overseas, I lived in England for a long time. I just found that I was spending more and more time in Italy. And so John Cabot University is very interesting place. And, frankly, they do a lot of entrepreneurial instruction, but they have a lot of need for Americans like me to come over and spend time. So I just was over there last month. I brought over a friend from Uber. We're bringing over other Americans that are active in venture capital and private equity and AI, and we're bringing them over and we're doing seminars and discussions. I mentor a lot of students. I'm in the classroom talking about entrepreneurship and innovation. We're working with the professors on how do you bring AI into the classroom, because I think that you can't really do liberal arts anymore without understanding and appreciating how to bring AI in. I think AI is now part and should be part of liberal arts canon, the way math and science and English and the classics are. I just don't think you can train people to be adept humanists unless you teach them how to work with AI. So it's a really interesting engagement. Fairfax City just entered into a relationship with us where they're going to take some of the John Cabot students and have them intern for them around economic development. And we're going to start to bring Cabot students over on a regular basis to work in the region around economic development and working with startups here. I want to really, really connect our region with Italy. I'm also, you mentioned Rome. I'm also doing a lot of work in Milan, which is basically the business center of Italy, working with Zambon, a biotech company up there, to do a femtech-focused startup accelerator. We just finished our first cohort. I'm going to be doing that as well. But I think there's a lot of scope for this region to be more closely connected with Italy, because Italy has an enormous need for innovation, and they don't have access to a lot of people like us. So as I may just actually serve the region some by serving myself. And by the way, the food is really, really good.
I was supposed to go to Italy, but it got canceled with the pandemic and a little bout of COVID that I got. So it's a little triggering for me to have this conversation and be thinking about that, but that's okay. So it's on the list.
Well, the good news is it's been there for a couple thousand years, and I think it'll be
I'm
there for a while longer.
hoping it'll be
So I
there
think we'll
for
be
another
okay.
minute.
Yeah, yeah, I
Yes,
think we'll be
yes,
okay.
yeah. I'm curious when, and I have the opportunity to teach or to speak and engage. I'm curious what you've learned from students in that environment. Do you have any interesting, takeaways that they have taught you while you've been there?
Well, I think in general, I will. God, I feel like I'm just being so bleak. You probably, this interview is going to make on the cutting room floor because I'm going to make you suicidal. But the most important thing that I'm learning right now is actually a troubling thing, which is I think the smartphones are absolutely slaughtering our kids, particularly young men. I have seen a dramatic, between that and COVID, I have seen almost a pall come over the attitudes and the level of engagement of the 20-year-old students now compared to 5 or 10 years ago. Now, the outliers, the ones that are engaged, still stand out. They've always, people who are really engaged will always stand out. And there's nothing as rewarding as a professor as having a student who's really engaged. And I will tell you that Cabot, because everybody who's there is either an American student who chose to study overseas or is an international student, an Italian student who's choosing to study in an American university in Italy, they're all very outward thinking students. So it's a very rewarding place to teach, which leads me to think my positive life lesson is the more that students and our children are exposed to the broader world, the more engaged they are and the more engaging they are. So if anything, I'm a bigger believer. I would want every parent to encourage their students to spend 6 months overseas at Cabot or someplace else. That's a positive thing I've learned. The negative thing I've learned is, and I saw this when I was still dean at Marymount as well, I think that COVID and smartphones and the technology has, particularly with young men, created a sense of disablement that is very profound and we shouldn't ignore. Demographically, it's really concerning, but you would expect that the death rates of cohorts would go up as cohorts get older. Do you know that the death rate of young people is actually comparable to really old people because of teen suicides? We have a suicide epidemic in this country because our kids are feeling alienated. So the biggest thing I worry about, to be honest, as an educator, and I see this in the classroom every day, is we need sometimes to grab our students by the scruff of their necks, figuratively, and say, look at me, make eye contact, pay attention, because if you don't have the ability to engage, going back to what we were talking about 15 minutes ago, if AI commoditizes everything, and if you can't engage and connect, you're useless in the world that's being created. That's my biggest fear and my biggest concern, that we are allowing technology to numb our students at a time when they frankly need to be hyper engaged, not numb.
Oof.
Sorry.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
no, 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 I did. I did. Oh, make me
Yeah.
all learn. I won't learn. No, it's good. No, I thank you for that. And you're right. There's got to be a connection between the smartphone and, connectivity in that space, and FOMO, or comparing ourselves to what we think another person is dealing with, and some of these, life altering decisions.
Listen, the good news is that I think that things like Google Glass and Meta Glass and so forth, within a relatively short period of time, they're going to be mediating the social world for us, and we're just not going to be going to websites being subjected to happy Facebook anymore.
Mhm.
So that's the good news. But look, I really, I don't want to portray it as a completely negative thing. The point is that you asked me what we need to worry about. This is what we have to worry about. The good news is it's a solvable problem.
Mm.
All just educators just need to understand the responsibility is to get students out of the sense of disablement by making sure that the classroom experience is engaging. They need to make sure that AI needs to be part of the curriculum because students are using it so they understand how to be value add on top of it. This is a problem that frankly we can solve as parents and educators and as friends, but you can't solve the problem unless you call the problem out. And that's my goal. But I'm not a nihilist about it at all. I think it's actually a solvable problem.
Look at you. Yeah, a little bit of
Hey,
optimism there. Yay. Cool.
that's true. I mean, we're having this conversation today. Listen, if one person listens to your podcast says, you know what, I need to go home tonight, and when my kid takes out the smartphone at dinner, I need to take it away from them and make them have a conversation, make eye contact,
Mhm.
then it was worth having this conversation, you and I.
Yeah, thank you. So kind of want to bring our time to a conclusion because I know people don't like 6 hour long podcast episodes, but
They don't?
no,
Huh.
um, so I would love just advice. Obviously, you just gave a little parenting and future advice. What advice would you give, or somebody that was maybe new-ish in economic development or looking to make a change, trying to figure out how to engage their community and their region?
Well, I think first of all, I think that economic development is actually one of the few places in our society where you can get involved and make a difference without having to engage in necessarily the culture wars or the partisan politics that choke so much of our discourse. Because while there may be arguments about tactics, you may argue about whether or not a data center is a good or bad thing, or a casino is a good or bad thing, or changing the regulation of profits is a good or bad thing. You may argue about those things as a matter of policy, but at the end of the day, nobody argues about whether or not we need to have economic growth. So if I was going to pick a career where I could make the world better and be able to say that I'm really nonpartisan, I'm just trying to work with everybody, this is one of the careers where I think that's possible. And I think it will continue to be the case, whoever and however the culture wars and everything else in our society plays out. The second thing is, I think it's a multidisciplinary career. The nice thing about economic development, at least as I've experienced it, is that it will allow you to take your life in many different directions. The skills that I've developed that I use for writing a column or talking about policy or making investments, it's all the same skills. So if I was starting out a career, I think that this would be an area that would provide a lot of opportunity for personal and career growth. Your career could go in a lot of different directions. So I like it a lot for that reason.
I agree. As somebody whose career has gone in different directions
Mm-hmm.
and the things. So, our last question that we like to ask all of our guests is, what was your EDO breakthrough?
I think for me, it was probably being the um, being the unspoken engine for the Amazon bid. Forbes actually called me the unsung hero, which was nice of them. But I had been advocating for this region for quite some time as an innovation region, and largely fallen on deaf ears. And when I learned about through my contacts and the McCoff administration and also my work in the partnership that Amazon was thinking about the region seriously, I learned that they were very concerned that we were a region of service providers and we didn't have innovators here. And I made it my business at the time I was writing in the Post, as well as a business owner. I made it my business to start writing pieces, making the arguments for why we were an innovation region. At the same time as I was generating reports and work product for the partnership and others to use in their conversations with Amazon. And it was really satisfying. And a lot of people have a lot of success to share about why it happened. But for me, it really was the first moment where I saw that the various things that I'd done to create my expertise and create my credibility in the platforms, I was able to push all those chips in the middle of the table and actually make a difference. So for me, that was probably the watershed moment and maybe the most satisfying moment I've had in my career as being involved in public service, where I just was able to behind the scenes actually make something happen that, maybe wouldn't have happened otherwise. I'm glad you asked me about it because I don't get to talk about it much. But yeah, it was a really important moment for me and something I'll really treasure my whole life.
Awesome. Jonathan, I want to thank you for joining us today. I'm sure our listeners got some interesting nuggets
I hope
out
so.
of this conversation. And where could they learn more? Where could they hear more of Jonathan insights?
Well, What's Working in Washington is my podcast, and you can find that on all the podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, whatever. That's where I do a lot of this stuff. I also write in the Business Journal. You can keep an eye on that. I tend to write there. Those are probably the two big avenues right now. You can find me on Blue Sky. I'm on Twitter. I'm on LinkedIn. But probably from the standpoint of content, What's Working in Washington and the Business Journal are probably the best places to look for me.
Awesome. Thank you. The EDO Breakthrough podcast is brought to you by PPR Strategies. PPR Strategies, standing for People and Places Reimagined, is a strategic consulting firm working specifically with EDOs and other place-based organizations. We share the unique stories of communities through communication, strategic planning, marketing, media relations, and more. Visit us at pprstrategies.com and find our contact information in the show notes. I'd like to give a big thank you to you for listening. Remember, together we are unstoppable.